Last year we did a full inside and out episode on these, our Class 20s, which we have here at the Watercress line to show you just how they work. And it was pretty well received. Now our Class 47 recently has been out of service undergoing major works. So we thought, given the opportunity, it would be rude not to do its very own episode. So we asked Richard down to give us a full inside and out of the Class 47.
Okay then, so I'm back again. Richard Bentley, the ops manager. A few people wanted to see a bit more of the other diesel types after we did the Class 20 episode. So yeah, a little bit about the 47. Class 47 here, originally they were known as the Brush Type 4. They were built into sort of two main batches. There was an initial 20 that were produced, the D1500 with the original pre-production batch. And then there was, I think, 512 built in total. This one here is 47579, James Nightall GC. And it's owned and on loan to us from the Mangaps Railway Museum in Essex. A fantastic museum. If anyone gets a chance to go there, it really is worth visiting. So yeah, the guys there purchased this in about 2002, I think it was, from EWS. It was in EWS livery when it was withdrawn, and also running with another name. It's carried several names in its time. It was St Augustine as part of the Rail Express Systems livery, and also ran as Sir Christopher Wren. So finished up as 47793. So has had some interesting history. Originally built as D1778 in 1964. And spent a lot of its time in the Immingham area working coal trains and freight trains in the Derby Immingham area, and then under the top system 1974 became 47183. Originally built with a steam heat boiler. When these things were introduced, most of the railway was still steam heat stock from when the steam fleet was still running about, so had steam heat boiler in this end of the Loco. And then sort of mid-80s they went for a major re-engineering system and produced what became the 47-4 type, of which this became, and basically lost its steam heat boiler and was given electric train heating. So there's a means of providing electric train heat at about 800-900 volts through to the coaches for train heat and latterly air conditioning. So then that's why it went from 47183 to 579 when it underwent that works at Crewe. So yeah, pretty much we'll take you through the inside. We'll climb up inside and have a look through the inside and show you all the bits and pieces. Okay then, so we've just come out of the number 2 cab. I think, as we said when we talked about the 20s in the past, because this is a Loco with 2 cabs, there's always a number 1 and a number 2 end. Number 1 end is always where the cooler group is, the radiators and the likes and the hydrostatic fans. So this end is basically number 2 end. We just come from the number 2 cab into what was still ironically called the boiler room, even though the boiler room was disappeared in the sort of late 1980s. So historically this would have had a Spanner or a Clayton boiler in here to provide steam heating for the passenger stock. That was removed under the 47-4 rebuilding scheme, and as a result the space was then used for the box of tricks here, which is part of the load regulation side. All of the solid state cards are in the bottom of this box. You've also got auxiliary train heat and an overload switches on the back, so you've got some indications that you can see from the cab window. Also in the back of the compartment here we've got a traction motor blower to force air down onto the traction motors to keep them cool. There's some additional air tanks, and there's also a fuel tank just in the corner behind the handbrake. The fuel tanks on the 47s are generally internal, and some of them, like this one, had extra tanks added underneath. There's another 500 gallons added underneath. So there's 700 inside and 500 underneath. So that gives them a fair range. When the steam heat boiler was done away with, that actually increased the space underneath for the additional fuel tanks, which is where the extra 500 gallons came from. Although the thought of chucking 500 gallons of red diesel in this day and age, I think we're up to about £1.10 a litre. As I say, that starts ringing alarm bells when you start looking at that much sort of cost. Ironically as well, as you'll see as you come through, on the 47 body shell there were only literally 4 windows, 4 little rectangular windows. They're beautifully designed in the sense that they managed to put equipment in front of virtually every single window. So they're not a lot of use, about as much use as a handbrake on a canoe, those. So we'll carry on through. Just in the bottom of the cubicle here we've got the load regulation cards and modules. That sits just in the bottom of the compartment here. From a prep point of view, there's not a lot to have anything to do with those. There are 1 or 2 fault indication lights on them, but generally they'll come up with a general fault and it's back to shed for fitters' attention. So it's more a case of knowing where they are rather than having to do too much with them. Also in the corner as you come in, there's a CO2 fire bottle. The Loco's fitted with about 4 of those in total, and they're operated from press buttons in the cab and in the engine room. So if there's a fire, basically the suppression is done by CO2, starving the fire of oxygen. But as we said before, if they go off, this is not somewhere you want to be in and around it, because it's as much as it will take the oxygen away from the fire, it will do the same for yourself. Okay, so as we go through, there's a few holes in the roof that have been panelled over. That's basically where the chimney for the boiler used to be, and safety valves and so on and so forth. And as I say, originally the fireman or second man would have been in here keeping the boiler going. But as I say, that was done away with, I think probably late 80s, I think was when the 47.4 thing started going through crew works and removing boilers, primarily as the steam heat stock gradually disappeared. I think the last of steam heat was about 87, 88 in Scotland, so that's really when that system disappeared. Okay, then we'll go a bit further forward in towards the engine compartment. So we've just come through the archway from the boiler room, from the number 2 cab through the boiler room through the archway. The archway basically contains what's historically sort of considered the control cubicle, if you like. So either side of the archway is all the contactors for starting, oil pressure, water pressure, all the kind of things that stop the engine from actually starting, if you like. We've also got the reversers in the bottom of the cabinets for the contactors. So basically all this switch gear is contained within these 4 cabinets. In the middle of the panel, we've got various fault lights to show whether we got the traction motor blowers are working, earth fault, overload, water temperature, water pressure, oil pressure, and so on and so forth. We've got a charge-discharge thing from the battery side of things to prove that everything's working as it should do. We've got an engine hours meter, so we can register between exams how often the engine's from a preservation point of view. Diesel locos don't do an awful great high mileage because of the length of the railways they run on, but the engines can sit in idle for an awful long time. So it's probably key to actually record the engine hours, because an engine could sit for sort of 11 hours a day doing nothing and only do 2 miles. So we tend to work the maintenance on an hours basis rather than pure mileage. We've also got a control air pressure gauge at the top from some control air, so basically to provide to throw all the reversers, control gear and everything. And we've got the TPWS isolation switch on there. This was being one of the last ones to work for EWS. It was fitted with TPWS. It is in and working, albeit the railway's not equipped with it. So it never quite managed the data recorder, but it was one of the last few to run for EWS in about 2002, 2003. And then opposite that, we've got some switch gear in the cabinet on this side. Basically, that's the cubicle there where we can actually isolate traction motors. We can switch over between air and vacuum brake. We can remove exhausters, switch them out, switch them in to provide vacuum. We can also put the Loco in what's called maintenance, where you can actually rev the engine up without providing power to the motors. So if you're doing maintenance on the power unit, you've got that ability. There's also actually quite interesting, there's a wheel wear compensator switch in there, which as you turn the tyres, there's actually a switch in there to actually alter the wheel diameter, because as you turn tyres, that actually has an impact on the speedometer readings. As the wheel gets smaller, then that puts the speedo out of calibration. And then the panel this side is basically some fuses, some fairly big heavy fuses, 125 amp, 160 amp fuses, and some circuit breakers in the top that if the blue light comes on, the blue light of doom comes on in the cab, we basically come back in here to say that you've got a fault. This will point you in the direction of what the fault is, and then hopefully you can find an MCB or a fuse to sort out the actual problem and try and rectify it. And then, as I say, as you come through here, then it splits to the side of the engine. We're at the turbo end of the engine and the exhaust. We've got the battery isolating switch down on the floor by my left leg here. And then we go down the side of the power unit. There's not a massive amount to see with the power unit because obviously most of it's boxed in to keep fingers and everything out of harm's way. But we have sort of produced some bits and pieces earlier on while we've been going through the engine power unit overhaul, which we can hopefully sort of show you a bit more of the nuts and bolts and actually what's going on the inside. Okay, well, so we're currently in the Chamber of Horrors on 47579, James Nightall. We're basically looking at the engine block of a 12-cylinder Sulzer engine undergoing a pretty comprehensive overhaul at the moment. It failed just prior to the Diesel Gala in June 2021 with leaking liner seals. So we basically had to strip the engine right back and pull the liners out so we can actually replace all of that. And it's a pretty unusual opportunity to see an engine in this state. So we thought we'd cover this while we're doing the work, just to give you a bit of a view of what happens in the heart of the engine and how it's really put together. So as you can probably see, if I hold the light up, there's a big series of fairly large holes just on the top of the block. Each one of those is a piston. It's actually, as I say, this is basically an inline engine, so it's a 12-cylinder, it's a 12 LDA 28B Sulzer engine, 2,580 horsepower it's rated at. But it's pretty unusual in the sense that it's effectively two inline engines side by side. So there's basically six holes for cylinders this side and six the other, all in one casting. So in the bottom of here is a crankshaft under each row. So it's actually two crankshafts, effectively two engines in one. And at the end, near where you stood, is a set of phasing gears, which basically keeps everything in phase, keeps the crankshafts all, so the firing order is kept exactly as it should be. So basically in the holes here is where the liner sits, and basically that's a steel cylinder that the aluminium piston runs up and down in. And that's sealed top and bottom with a series of O-rings to maintain basically the water pressure and keeps the water from the oil underneath in the crankshaft. And unfortunately, just prior to the Diesel Gala in June 2021, several of the liner seals failed. They're a rubber O-ring effectively, which have got a finite life. They fail, and it allows basically water to seep through from the coolant into the engine and emulsifies the oil, ruins the oil, and obviously has an awful lot of problems with lubrication and damage into the bearing surfaces. So on the top of there, we would normally have the liner with the piston in it, and then the heads go down onto these head studs. They're wound down, torqued down at about 800 to 900 foot-pounds. So there's an awful lot of pressure on those to keep them down, keep them tight. And then as we can see on here, we've got the push rods. And basically these operate the valves and the rockers on the top, which open and close the inlet and the exhaust valves on the top of the heads. There, actually, if you come down along the side here, we've got what's called the gallery. Each head then has got its own fuel pump, which basically pumps fuel up to the injector, which is in the head. So that sprays fuel. It's a 4-stroke engine, so suck, squeeze, bang, blow. Each head has got its own pump. That's fed off the fuel rack, which is opened by the governor. And the push rods and the pump are run by a camshaft. So down the bottom here, we've got a camshaft that rotates, and there's various poppets that sort of stick up and down, and each one will operate, this one operates the push rod above it, that one will operate the fuel pump, and that'll operate the other push rod to the valves. So this is driven again off the gearing from the crankshaft, so everything is in the right order. It opens the valves in the right order for basically induction, compression, exhaust. Yeah, unfortunately, best part of £2,500 worth of oil thrown in the bin, mixed with water, just turns into sort of like a mayonnaise, a sort of emulsified oil. We've had to have the glorious job of going in there and cleaning the sump right out, up to your elbows in it, and not a very easy thing to get at, and certainly not a very pleasant job to do. But we need to make sure all of the grotty oil is taken out. So yeah, so quite unusual. And as I say, you can, if you look further back, you can see the second crankshaft for the other side is just behind it. On the Class 20s that we looked at once before, they were a V engine. So you have one crankshaft and then you have four piston rods that come off of it in the V formation. These are basically is a twin bank 12, so it's 6 and 6. And as I say, apart from the fact it's a shared sump, it's effectively two engines back to back. It's a very, very complicated casting. You know, as I say, when you look at it, it must have taken a fair bit of organising to actually produce the castings and then ultimately to machine them out. But as you can see, the brown area is where all the water's been, and obviously an element of rust that forms with anything that contains water. And just at the bottom is where the liner seals really are at their most important, as I say, protecting the water from the oil. It's basically a series of about 3 O-rings. The Sulzer engines are primarily a marine engine. They were built for sort of a marine use, and ships tend to run at a constant temperature, a constant rate of RPM. They don't tend to sort of have a lot of expansion, contraction. Putting them in the railway environment, there's a lot of engines sit around for weeks on end not doing anything. They get very hot, they get very cold. So there's a finite life on these O-rings, and we believe these were last done, I think, at Healy Mills in 1993. So here we are in 2022. They haven't done too bad. They probably don't owe us a lot by now, but still a massive job to try and deal with. So just looking along the rest of the block, we've got some, basically all the pipe work in here is colour coded. So anything blue is water. So we've got various water pipes running along the top. That leads to the end of the turbo. You see the turbo manifold there with the 4 exhaust holes in it. So the exhaust from the engine goes into those, which is fed into the turbo. And that basically just gives a bit more boost to the engine, gives it a bit more power. We've also got from the air intake side here, just behind me, there's an intercooler. And there again, just by basically trying to cool the air, you get a bit more volume of air in through the turbo. So basically the more you can cool it, the better the buck for you. And then beyond me is the main generator and the auxiliary generator. But as I say, we've currently got an awful lot of stuff in the corridor there. The crankcase cover door, for example, that covers the crankshaft. Ironically, unless you take the roof off, you can't get it out of the Loco. There is a side door behind me, but that's barely big enough to get a person through, so it certainly won't cope with taking the door through. Interesting little thing here, there's a flap just on the inside the engine room door. That was originally where the steam heat water tank would be filled from. So there was actually an inward pushing flap that went into a box to go through this panel on the floor by my foot there. And that would have filled the tank underneath for the steam heat boiler when it was fitted in the early 80s. So you could still pull into a station platform and put the water bag in like we would on a steam engine, in through the side, fill the tank up. Long since disappeared. I think it was about 1981. That was all done away with, but as I say, you still see little bits of it to this day. And that's also why on the outside there's grab handles up the side, basically so the fireman, second man, could hang himself up the side and put the hose in and try not to soak himself while he puts the water in the tank. And just looking around the rest of the top, there's varying air filters. Obviously we try and limit the amount of muck and stuff that comes into the engine room. Anything that ends up in the engine wants to be as clean as possible, so we try and filtrate any air, and obviously that's always difficult when you're working in an environment with steam engines. There's always ash and all manner of muck floating around the place, but anywhere where there's an air intake, there's generally a filter, which sort of every 6 months supposed to be changed and clean right out. And that's about where we're at the moment. So at the moment the pistons are away for machining. They should be, I think they've completed, they should be back with us in the next few weeks. And then we can start putting the engine back together again. But as I say, thought while we've got the opportunity to show you the Chamber of Horrors with it all stripped down, it was worth the chance. Just coming through we've got an oil tank here on the immediate side here. That's for the hydrostatic system. Basically, is a hydraulic system to run the fans. This has got 2 exhaust fans in the roof. The idea is the exhaust fans draw the air through the fins of the radiators and cool the coolant. Down on the floor here is really the heart of the engine. That's what's called the triple pump. And like it says on the tin, it does 3 things. It pumps oil, it pumps water, it pumps fuel around the engine. So before the engine started up, That'll be basically priming, building up. An engine generally won't start without sufficient oil pressure. It basically needs to make sure it's got sufficient quantities of that before the system will allow the engine to start and run. You'll often hear that wear it away before the engine starts up, electric pump basically pumping. And then on the wall in the engine bay in here, there's 6 gauges which give the oil, water pressure, temperatures and everything to see how things are going. On the right-hand side of me, left-hand side to yourself, we've got some various relay valves from the brake side of things, which is actually also where the urinal was originally, so it's never a very nice place to be. Generally, most people struggle to find the bowl when the bathroom's not going at 90 mile an hour, but all the more difficult when you're in here with all this going on, trying to find the right bullseye. We've got 2 compressors, so basically anything on the Loco, all of the Loco brakes are operated by air. So these 2 compressors will provide that compressed air system and charge up the various reservoir tanks. So these are running pretty much all the time. Although the engine can work vacuum brake trains, all of the brake gear on a diesel locomotive is air brake operated. So we'll reduce the vacuum on the train pipe in the carriages, but it's always air that applies the brakes on the Loco. So they're absolutely key. If those pack up, the engine loses its air, it realises it hasn't got enough air, it applies the brake, and that's where you sit, and then it's phone a friend time. So then working back down towards the cab, there's various governors here for basically looking to make sure there's enough brake system, enough brake pressure, enough control air, and there again lots of fail safes. So if things aren't working right, it won't let you go. I've got the vacuum pipe comes up into the engine room through the floor, and there's an isolating cock there for the vacuum side of things. All of this, when the Loco came here from Mangaps, we had to replace this because the engine finished up in service as an air brake Loco only. So we've basically had to put all this back in and the exhausters since the engines arrived here. I'll work my way down. Normally the floors in these originally were absolutely swimming. I always used to call it the Black Sea because this was really, it was full of oil virtually up to the metal plates. You always knew if the fitters had been on board because you'd have black footprints in the cab. So we've got 2 exhausters, and they basically are electric motors that drag the air out of the system and create the vacuum to operate the brakes on our coaches. So the old 60s coaches basically were all vacuum braked. And as the 60s came in and the 70s started, British Rail went more over to air brake. It's a far more efficient set of brakes, quicker to operate. You get more pressure for the size of the cylinder. So as the vacuum system became obsolete, a lot of these were taken out just because it was extra stuff to maintain that it didn't really need. So yeah, those had to, basically these 2 machines had to come in through the narrow engine room door and through the cab door. And as I say, we could have probably funded the job based on the square box contents alone, but the second one went in a damn sight quicker than the first, but none of us are quite sure quite how we did that. Moving further forward towards the number, this is the number 1 end of the locomotive. So number 1 compressor, this is number 2. This probably gets the most use. This 47 has got air start contactors, so the engine actually requires 50 pounds per square inch of air to close the start contactors on it. Some of them were electric, quite a few of them were air, and this is one of those. So you'll actually hear the compressor run until 50 pounds per square inch of air is created before you can close the contactors. So this old compressor tends to get the lion's share of the work, and is actually due some TLC in due course. Second exhauster, so basically there's 2 exhausters, basically one to run the normal service, and then the other one will speed up if you need it to release the brakes in a hurry. Varying check valves and application valves, timing valves, all manner of clever bits and pieces that operate the train brakes. And then that brings us forward to what we call the snail. It's a traction motor blower, like we saw in the nose of the 20. It basically blows forced air down into the traction motors below. When the engines are working at their hardest, they're often at their slowest, so it's all the more important that we keep those motors cool. When the engine's racing along at 70, 80 mile an hour, there's plenty of air rushing around them, but at sort of 4 or 5 mile an hour where the traction current's at its highest, it's all the more important to keep the cold air. So there's this one in this end, and there's also one in the boiler room at the far end. We still call it the boiler room. The boiler room disappeared in 1981. It's still known as that. And that's basically got a big fan on the end of that electric motor blowing forced air down through. And then that basically brings us to the cab door. We've got a big air tank On your left there, as you just inside the door, that's one of the main reservoir tanks that stores the air pressure for the various brake systems. The guts of the handbrake is just in the door on this side, and we've got the dead man's isolating cock up in that side. So that's basically if we had to operate the dead man's safety device because of a failure, that's where you have to go. And part of the preparation checks is to make sure that it's in and working. And we test it from both cabs before we go into service just to prove that it's working as well. So an important part of the equipment, but equally most things, as I think we've said before with the training on these things, it's not about what equipment there is, it's more about where it is. Nearly everything's got the same equipment, but every manufacturer, every builder did something in a different place in a novel location. So it's more a case of knowing where to go and what to do with it rather than what you're looking for. Okay then, so we're in the number 2 cab of 47579. Not to be believed on the top where it says 47793, but that's a sort of a hark back to its EWS days. So basically it's quite a smart looking desk, various gauges across the front here. So from left to right we've got the main reservoir gauge, that's the amount of air pressure that's available on the locomotive for working all the brakes and so on and so forth. The next one across has got 2 needles in it. That's one for each bogie, so that's how much brake is being applied on each bogie of the Loco itself. The next one across is the vacuum gauge. We've got 2 needles there, one for the vacuum chamber, which is how much is actually holding the brake, and the brake pipe is actually how much is actually applying on the cylinder, so that will read between 21 and 0. Speedometer, all of these were rated at 95 mile an hour from new. They're more than capable of 100, but they were rated at 95. Like most things, it says what it says on the tin. The next one across is the brake pipe gauge, which is basically the air brake pipe, the red one on the buffer beam for working air brake stock. So normally that would be indicating at 72.5 psi or 5 bar in new money. And the last one across there is the ammeter. So basically how much traction power is being applied when the power handle's opened. That'll indicate how much power is going to the motors and how much work you're doing effectively. So 0 shows nothing, and then there's various bits sort of green. We try and keep it in the green all the time. There is sort of yellow, and some indicate red, where you can dip into if in extreme cases, extremely heavy loads for short periods. But there's a worry obviously if you go in there for too long, you can overheat the traction motors because the blowers can't keep up with the sort of the amount of heat that it generates. So coming back to this side again, this one was added a headlight switch because obviously in the late 80s, early 90s, everything had to have a headlight, so there's an additional switch that was put on there. We've got the train brake handle there. It's Davison Metcalf FV4 valve. Basically, that operates the vacuum brake or the air brake, depending what type of train you're working. Running position, initial through to full service. And that will apply on this Loco. Effectively, it applies the air brake, which then in turn operates the vacuum if it's in use. So the Loco itself is purely air, but it's capable of operating vacuum trains as well. So there's no vacuum equipment as such, or no vacuum cylinders. It's all air brake on these. There's an anti-slip button. So if the engine is starting to slip a little bit, you can press that button and get sort of 5, 10, 15 psi of air on the Loco brakes, just to try and stop the wheels from spinning. When they were built, there was a button on the end of the power handle, but they were always problematic to try and get the button working. So these were added with a later button on the desk. Loco brake valve there, direct air brake, straight air brake in old money. That's basically applying the Loco brakes only. So you can have the brakes fully released on the train in that position, but the brakes fully applied on the Loco, so that when you're ready for the right of way, the train's ready to move, you just release the Loco brake and the train will move. It's also used for light engine running. If you're running around with no train on, that will basically do all the work for you. 3 fault lights. There's a red one, engine stopped. When the key goes on and the master switch is open, that will go bright red as the engine fires up and the oil pressure and everything's happy and the engine run solenoid clicks in. That'll go dim as a red, but it'll still be lit. There's a yellow wheel slip light, which does what it says on the tin. If the wheels start slipping, you'll get a bright yellow light. And the general fault alarm one is the blue one. All of these lights are lit all the time, and they'll go bright if they're actually indicating something that you need to get involved with. AWS reset button on the middle of the desk. Sunflower is up on the bulkhead here. That's showing at the moment that it's the last indication was a caution. The horn will sound and you have to acknowledge it, and that will go black and yellow on the Sunflower. If we approach a green signal, we'll get a bell or ring and the Sunflower will go all black. We don't need to acknowledge that. That's just purely a passive one in that case. So still much the same as uses on the network as it stands. Working across then, we've got the horn, so we've got high and low tones, and there's also, if we move it to the side, we can blow one of the high note on the cab the other end. So if we're reversing, you can actually just move that across and sound the horn in the other cab, just to warn anyone behind us. We've got a washer button and a windscreen wiper control, and then just above that is the engine start, engine stop buttons. Coming further across then, we've got the power handle and the master switch. So basically it's in off at the moment and it's locked in that position. There's a master key, goes in the front of the desk there, which releases this to the forward, reverse, engine only positions. And then at that point, this then also releases the power handle in forward or reverse to be able to actually take power. So it's all interlocked, because basically what we don't want to do is have more than one controller open in any cab at any one time. Unlike the Class 20, you can only be in one cab. On these ones, someone could be in the other end. So the last thing we want is two desks open at once. And then last but not least, over this side, we've got a train heat light to show when the electric train heat's working. We've got an brake overcharge button. So particularly with air brake stock, it's best to do an overcharge where you basically overcharge up to about 80 psi of air, and then over 4 or 5 minutes you let the air bleed off, so everything's equalised. So that's not something we get too involved in this part of the world, because we're all vacuum pretty well here. There's a fire alarm test button that'll test the fire alarm in both cabs, just to prove that the circuit's live and working. And we've got a train heat on and off buttons for the electric train heat. As I say, none of our stock is fitted with that, so that's not something we have too much to do with. And then the panel of switches on here, they've basically got engine room lights, foot warmers, cab heaters, tail lights, demister for the windscreen, and then instrument lights and the train classification indicator, which is basically the two white dots on the front. Originally, as built, these had a head code box in the front. You had the 4-digit 1M33 would have been in the front. You had various handles to wind those, and there was a little window that you'd have to look down here and one on the second man side to try and work out what it was showing on the outside. In truth, it was actually easier to keep getting down and looking. But as I say, that's still got a bit of a hark back to the original purpose of the exterior lights. Going across the second man side, we've got a little cooker for boiling a kettle. You can do a half decent meal on that. There's a warning horn for the second man side, wiper controls, and a dead man's holdover button. Up above the windscreen, we've got the TPWS equipment. So we've actually got working TPWS on this one. It's also got a propelling advisory system, which when it worked for the Rail Express Systems parcels work, they were used for a time for propelling vehicles into mail terminals. Hence what the cab-to-cab phone is for, to be able to talk to the shunter at the other end. And this used to give an assurance tone to know it was still okay to keep pushing back. And then on the back wall, we've got not an awful lot of equipment. We've got the handbrake on the back wall that applies the brakes on this bogie when we're stabling the engine at night as the air brake pressure leaks off. It's just a mechanical means of securing the locomotive at night. There's one in each cab, we apply both. And then on the top, well, we've got the change end switch for opening up the cab, and also starts the AWS on the Loco. And then we've got the AWS warning horn, the bell, and the fire bell on the back wall. And that's pretty much the cab equipment, I think. So we'll have a look. We'll start running the pump in a moment. We have to run the pump for 2 minutes to prime the engine, and then we'll take an oil level check. So we'll start running the pump. I'll put it into engine only. That unlocks the master switch. Into engine only, you can start to hear. We've now got this one's fitted with air start contactors. So in actual fact, what's happening at the moment is one of the compressors is running, which is making a dreadful noise outside now as the air's leaking. That's now pumping up a reservoir to 50 psi of air to be able to close the start contactors when we're ready. And there's also the triple pump is running, which is now pumping oil, water and fuel around the engine, preparing it for a start. So that'll get the oil pressure in the right place. And I'll have a walk back through and check the oil. The engine should be all primed with oil pressure and everything else, so we'll go press and hold the start button and go for the start. And even though the engine's now running, I'm looking for the engine stop light to go dim, and that'll prove that all the auxiliaries have cut in and all's running well. And now actually the engine should start, the compressors will carry on running now, start building air pressure up, and we'll start to see the main res start to climb up as it builds up the brake pressure. And in most cases you'll find with these that you can't, well in all cases, you can't move a Loco until you can stop it. So until we can generate at least 90 psi of air in the main res, we won't be able to create a brake pipe of 72.5 psi, and until we can do that we can't take power, so we can't move anywhere. So it's been very, very well thought through. You know, it won't let you get yourself into trouble, charge off before you can actually stop. Righto, we'll set the cab up so AWS goes in, get the lights up on the TPWS, black on the Sunflower, and that's all fired up. So we've got black and yellow on the AWS. TPWS is settled down. We'll create the air brake pipe, which will come up to 72.5 psi, and that's now releasing the straight air brake on the Loco. So basically what I'm looking at is basically checking to make sure that everything's working as it should do. If I apply the auto brake, I should start to see the bogey brake climb up on the Loco, and that's working proportionally, and equally I can apply it with a straight air brake. So everything's working as it should. I'll put it into forward. I'll do a dead man's safety device. I've got a pedal on the floor, it needs to be pressed all the time. By releasing that, it'll sound an alarm to wake me up to let me know that I've taken my foot off. We'll then see the train pipe start to fall and the Loco brake start to apply. There we go, so that's starting to fall. Loco brakes are coming on, so that's proving that the dead man's is working. Put my foot back on it, reset, and then we'll do a power test. So I'll take notch 1, we'll probably get about 2,000 amps on the ammeter with this one. There we go, 2 and a bit. So we've got power in forwards. I'll go to reverse. We've got power in reverse, and that just proves before we set off that we're not going to suddenly go down the sidings and then find we've got no power at all, we can't move. It's also proved that the reversers in the cubicle have thrown and that the reversers are working. So destroy the brake, I'll put my marker lights on, take the handbrake off, and we're ready to go. Okay.
Well, there you are guys, another in detail inside and out episode. And of course we do have more diesels here, but that's definitely one for another time. So thank you to you guys for watching. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. A huge thank you once again to our ops manager Richard for being so accommodating and giving us a good tour around. And we shall see you next time.